the demonization of Israel has greatly advanced in recent years. How do we know that? There was a study done by the University of Bielefeld in 2011, and that study showed that at least 150 million Europeans have a diabolical view of Israel. The study was carried out on behalf of the German Friedrich Ebert Foundation, which is close to the German Social Democratic Party. And in the poll, these people asked whether people whom they interviewed held the opinion that Israel is carrying out a war of extermination against the Palestinians. Well, you have here the figures, which shows what people in Europe think. 63% of the polls, that was the worst, and 39% the Italians, and the Netherlands, which was the best. Now, these are, of course, extremely anti-Semitic views, because in our culture of today, to say that somebody is in the process of committing genocide is the absolute evil in the perception of our time. We are back, in fact, with 150 million Europeans who have a mentality of the Middle Ages. Then the Jews were accused of the greatest evil at that time. The greatest evil at that time was to have committed the deicide, the killing of the alleged Son of God. Now, this study has not received any attention anywhere in Europe. The Europeans hide this. And this tells us a second thing, how degraded the norms and values of Europe are at present. Well, once you write about it, and occasionally I mention it somewhere, then you get reactions. Yes, the study wasn't done properly, or the sample isn't big enough, as if a sample of almost 6,000 people for a poll isn't big enough. And it's not the only study. In 2002, a similar study was done in Germany by the same university. It found that the number of people then was 51% who thought that Israel was committing genocide against the Palestinians. Well, here it's only 47.7, so there is great progress in Europe indeed. Well, there are more studies. In 2012, the Oslo Holocaust Center did a study in Norway where the question was even more direct. It asked, do the Israelis behave like Nazis? Well, you know that I have a special preference for Norway, and 38% of the interviewed answered in the positive. It said, indeed, the Israelis are behaving like Nazis. In 2003, a Eurobarometer study was done which found Israel as the second largest threat to world peace, after Iran. Well, you might realize that in the past 10 years, it isn't exactly Israel which has fought in Iraq and in Afghanistan, which has had a profound influence on the world, if it were only that the United States is almost bankrupt. It was the United States who fought there, a number of European countries and many Muslims. So you have seen here how deep this demonization has progressed into Europe. Now, then you get a number of questions. How do you demonize a nation to such an extent? What messages do you have to convey to do this? Who are the perpetrators who do this? And how do you transmit the messages? This is the essence of the analysis of the delegitimization process of Israel. The other aspects. In Hitler's time, the demonization of the Jews was very transparent. Everybody could see it. You had the Nazi party, the perpetrator, which called the Jews subhuman, vermin, bacteria. That was the message. And independent of that, you had large Christian movements, which had laid for centuries the groundwork for the diabolization of the Jews. The Catholic Church and Protestant movements such as the Lutherans had been heavily involved in this. But in Hitler's days, the demonization was transparent. Today it is not. Who is the Hitler of today? Ahmadinejad? Well, there are, for instance, 1.5 million anti-Semitic Norwegians who think that Israel behaves like the Nazis did. With the exception of a few Muslims, all the others probably have no intention to think that Ahmadinejad is their, and the Islamic Republic of Iran are their examples. And the same can be said about almost all the 150 million Europeans who think that Israel is running a war of extermination against the Palestinians. So, the major conclusion which we can already draw is that the current process of delegitimization of Israel is not transparent. It's simply not simple to analyze this demonization of Israel, while it was simple to analyze the pre-Second World War anti-Semitism. The present demonization process of Israel is opaque and complex, as those of you who are interested will see from my soon-to-come new book, Demonizing Israel and the Jews, 57 interviews. Few of the interviewees are here, and my publishers, Mr. Van Praag and Astrid, are also here. And this leads to another very important question. How have the Israeli government and its allies fought the demonization of Israel through the propaganda war? And I can also put it less diplomatically. Why have successive Israeli governments slept while the propaganda war against Israel progressed? In order to fight Israel's demonization, you have first to understand how does it really work. And if I had to address that today, I wouldn't finish in the course of the day. So I've picked out one major aspect of that demonization, the application of double standards. I've already given you an example of that. I have written a major essay, and what I'm giving today is a diluted version of that, and a few copies of that essay in the Journal for the Study of Anti-Semitism are here on the table for you to take with you, and the others can find it in the website of the Journal for the Study of Anti-Semitism in the most recent issue. Now, as I already said, the concept of demonization is extremely simple. It has three elements. You need a perpetrator, Hitler, for instance. You need a message, the Jews are subhuman, and you need vehicles of transmission, which Hitler had, of course, at his disposal through Goebbels in many ways. And I'll give a simple, brutal example. It's really brutal, but on these issues you can only be brutal, which I use very often when I talk to foreign audiences. I often say at the beginning of my lecture that I am going to demonize one of them. I pick a person in the audience and I say to him, "Your sister is a whore." I said it was brutal. In order to understand the demonization process, we can analyze this. I am the perpetrator. The demonization process is that the person I chose, at random very often, has a sister who is a whore, and the medium of transmission is the audience. It's very simple, the concept. It has taken me less than a minute to demonize the person. It will now take the demonized person at best a lot of time to get rid of what I have done. And I'll give you one example. The now ex-wife of the previous German president, Bettina Wolf, has been fighting in vain against anonymous accusation that she was an escort girl in her youth. No one has ever come forward to bring a personal testimony of this. Still, it is almost impossible for her to get rid of this slander. Now, I promise my audiences that at the end of my presentation, I will tell the person whom I have demonized how to answer the demonization. I'll tell it to you here up front in order not to leave you in tension. and the accusation was brutal, and the answer against it must also be brutal. The best answer is, I have no sister, you must have picked up your syphilis from somebody else. It's a good answer, but it doesn't help much if the perpetrator says to the person defamed, your brother is a pedophile. So we now understand the essence of how the demonization process works. The next step is then that one has to study the various modes of demonization. You can demonize through acts, such as boycott, divestment, and sanction. You can demonize verbally, and there is also pictorial demonization, for instance, through cartoons. I will to discuss thus, as said, one method of mainly verbal demonization. Verbal demonization consists of two broad categories. You can have false statements and you can have false arguments. So how do you demonize a country? Through false statement. The first way is through lies. For instance, one lie is that there was never a temple on the Al-Aqsa mountain. The biggest lie is Holocaust denial, because it means that the Jews have invented a mass murder against them, which has never happened. They did so to be seen as victims and raise pity. Another verbal method is false accusations. False accusations are different from lies in that you cannot so easily contest them. Factually, we can bring proof of the Holocaust, we can bring proof of the temple. Of a false accusation, you have to work much harder. The Austrian Jewish Prime Minister, Bruno Kreisky, a notorious self-hater, called the Jewish state, and I quote, semi-fascist. And he said about the Jewish people, if they are a people, they are an ugly people. To refute such a slanderous accusation is much more difficult than to refute a lie. Even worse is an accusation about the future. I have given you a partial example, the study of the Bielefeld University. Israel is conducting a war to exterminate the Palestinians. Well, we haven't yet exactly exterminated them, and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict isn't among the 50 most bloody conflicts since the Second World War, but it is going to happen in the future, and it's very difficult to fight against something which you are accused of, which will take place in the future. And another accusation about the future, the German Nobel Prize winner for literature, Günter Grass, who in his youth was SS, said that Israel is going to launch atomic bombs against Iran. You don't need any proof. It is difficult to refute because he says we are going to do it and you cannot prove that you are not going to do it. Then there are another way of false statements are exaggerations. You may remember that after the 2002 suicide bombing in the Park Hotel in Netanya, the Israeli army went into the refugee camp in Jenin. Palestinian leaders produced major lies about what had happened. Erekat said that 1,000 Palestinians had been killed. In reality, there had been about 55 Palestinian deaths, of whom most were in fact Palestinian terrorists. So, well, no, the main sources on the internet say 1,000. But there were other Palestinian leaders, they also said that the whole camp was destroyed, and afterwards everybody could check that it was a small part of the camp. But it isn't a lie. There were people killed, there was destruction, but it was a huge exaggeration. But this is the simple stuff. The simple stuff is the false statements. It gets much more difficult when we get to false arguments, and as they are often called in literature, fallacies. Fallacies differ from false factual information. It is that they are based on reasoning where the arguments which you bring forward do not back up the conclusion. There are three categories, major categories of fallacies of argument. You have them up here: emotional fallacies, ethical fallacies, logical fallacies. If you want a nice emotional fallacy, go into the speech of Obama to the Israeli youth. He says there, yes, which Israel, if I've spoken to Palestinian students, and these Palestinian students want to go ahead with their career and they don't look for war, and which Israeli parent wouldn't be impressed by that and wanted to help them. The fallacy, this is a typical emotional appeal, or what we call a subcategory of emotional appeals, sentimental appeals. Of course, he didn't say, I have met a couple of potential Palestinian suicide bombers, so which Israeli parent wouldn't like to help them? So you have here, but it's not so transparent for people who aren't trained to see where the fallacy.
What about Kerry, who compared yesterday in Turkey the terrorist of IHH, yes, being killed by us, by our army, to the victims in Boston? You heard about it?
No, you cannot look. There are endless examples of that. I mean, you find in this essay here, you find many more than I give here, and the essay doesn't exhaust my knowledge about double standards. So, what do double standards lead to? I'll give you an example from the animal world. Both the wolf and the bear are two ferocious animals. Now look at the different image of the wolf and the bear. The wolf eats grandmothers. The bear eats honey, according to Winnie the Pooh. If my smallest grandchild gets a teddy bear, that is fine. If somebody dares to give him a teddy wolf, the family will break off diplomatic relations with him. So that shows you in a very simple nutshell how you can apply double standards. Now, the use of different standards concerning Jews when compared to others has been a major element at the heart of anti-Semitic activities and incitement over many centuries. This was often so obvious that it was self-understood. When the Jews were confined to live in certain parts of town while the others could live everywhere, when they were not free to wear the clothes they wanted and others could wear whatever clothes they wanted, and they couldn't work in most professions, that was a classic element of how double standards in anti-Semitism worked. It meant that the double standards against them profoundly permeated most aspects of their lives. And if the Israeli government, the current one, isn't very carefully, we may get to a situation where our lives will be profoundly affected by the double standards, which lead to the demonization of Israel. Now, before I get into the examples, first of all, the definition. It's always good to look into the Oxford Dictionary. It says, it's a rule or moral principle that is unfair because it is used in one situation but not in another, or because it treats one group of people in a way that is different from the treatment of another. And the Cambridge Dictionary puts it somewhat more succinctly: a rule or standard of good behavior which unfairly some people are expected to follow or achieve, but other people are not. We have to follow international law. The European countries don't have to follow international law. Now, in the definition of anti-Semitism as set forth by the European Agency for Fundamental Rights, which was formerly the EUMC, that's a body of the European Union, it recognizes the important role double standards play in the discrimination of Israel. The document which contains this definition mentions that manifestations of anti-Semitism, I quote, could also target the state of Israel conceived as a Jewish collectivity. And that doesn't only refer to matters such as calling for or justifying the killing of Jews, dehumanizing and demonizing them, accusing them of imagined wrongdoing, denying the Holocaust, charging Jews with being like Nazis, but also with denying Jews the right to self-determination and applying double standards by requiring behavior of Israel that is not expected of any other democratic country. So this FRA definition thus distinguishes regular criticism of Israel from anti-Semitic expressions against Israel. Now, the trick on double standards, on analyzing double standards, is to categorize them. The strange thing is, and I myself and my research assistants and my interns have looked all over the internet to find on such a big issue as double standards a categorization. What are the categories of it? There is nothing like of it. Even not in the studies where you expect most of the double standards in gender studies. We know all the famous things. If you have a female applicant and a male applicant, it's more difficult for the female applicant to get the job. The salaries aren't equal. There is a glass ceiling. Yet in gender studies, no categorization exists of double standards, nor anywhere else. So I started out to build up a series of categories, and there are many examples in the essay. I'll run through here because I can't keep you for hours through the various categories. One category of double standards is bias declarations. You find these declarations in places such as the United Nations, other international organizations, government, parliaments, church leaders, media, trade unions, NGOs, academic bodies, and individuals. Let's take, it's already been mentioned by Ambassador Marzel, let's take a double standard on the Gaza flotilla. On 1 May 2010. On 2 June 2010, the German parliament, the Bundestag, adopted an unprecedented resolution. It stated that there was strong evidence that Israel violated the principle of proportionality in the raid. A European commentator pointed out that in the history of the Bundestag, it had never issued a resolution against any of the true rogue states in the world, no matter how inhuman they are. The Simon Wiesenthal Center noted in a public statement, "We heard no such unanimity from German politicians when Hamas and Hezbollah terrorists targeted Israeli civilians, including Holocaust survivors and their families." A typical case, perhaps the best case, of bias declarations concerns the condemnation of the Israeli killing of Hamas leader Sheikh Ahmad Yassin in 2004. There were many international reactions also to the killing of bin Laden by the US Army. So this provides us with a great opportunity to demonstrate the double standard against it by many of the Western countries. All you have to do is you put on one side what they said about the killing of Sheikh Yassin, you put on the other side what they said about bin Laden, a terrorist leader who was directly responsible for many murderous attacks on Israeli civilians, including suicide bombings. Now, here are the declarations. What says US Secretary General Ban Ki-moon about Osama bin Laden? The death of Osama bin Laden, announced by President Obama last night, is a watershed moment in our common global fight against terrorism. What does UN Secretary General Kofi Annan say after the killing of Sheikh Yassin? "I do condemn the targeted assassination of Sheikh Yassin and the others who died with him. Such actions are not only contrary to international law, but they do not do anything to help the search for a peaceful solution." After the bin Laden killing, the leaders of the European Council and the European Commission stated that bin Laden's death made the world a safer place and showed that terrorist attacks do not remain unpunished. What did Javier Solana, head of the European policy, say? I've already mentioned him today, following the Yassin killing. This type of action doesn't contribute at all to create the conditions of peace. This is very, very bad news for the peace process. The policy of the European Union has been consistent condemnation of extrajudicial killing. Must have been a change in policy since. What did British Prime Minister David Cameron say? He congratulated President Obama on the success of the assassination of bin Laden. Cameron considered it a massive step forward in the fight against extremist terrorism. Former Prime Minister Tony Blair welcomed bin Laden's demise. Well, what did the British government say about the killing of Sheikh Yassin? Then British Foreign Secretary Jack Straw called it unacceptable and unjustified. The official spokesman of Prime Minister Blair, who later would be happy about the killing of bin Laden, he condemned the unlawful attack and observed, quote, "We have repeatedly made clear our opposition to Israel's use of targeted killings and assassinations." A cynic taking Blair's spokesman's statement literally could now say that he was right. His boss was only against Israel's use of targeted killing. The Goldstone Report. The anti-Israel bias of the Goldstone Report on the caste-led war in Gaza has been exposed by many, including by NGO Monitor, the Jerusalem Center, and so on. The media watch organization Camera has listed specifically the double standards as applied against Israel by the Goldstone Commission. The analysis concludes, quote, "The report tends to base its acceptance of evidence less on the source of that evidence and much more on its target. That is, evidence damning Israel is normally deemed credible, whereas evidence exonerating Israel or damning Palestinians is explicitly or quietly dismissed." The BBC. Litigation lawyer Trevor Asserson, who has also spoken here, and interview with him is in my forthcoming book, has analyzed the BBC's reporting of a number of times. He has published many examples of double standards. Asserson compared, for instance, reporting on British military in the Iraq War and Israeli soldiers. Okay, about the British. Quote, "Coalition troops are described in warm and glowing terms, with sympathy being evoked for both as individuals and for the military predicament. In contrast, Israeli troops are painted as faceless, ruthless, and brutal killers with little or no understanding shown for their actions." Camera has exposed many examples of double standard by major news agency and primarily the American media. It has given particular attention to a great producer of double standards, the New York Times. Dexter van Zyl of Camera has focused on double standards of the World Council of Churches, and also that is in my forthcoming book. So that was the first category, the false declarations state. The second one is an even more tricky one, omissions. The second type of double standard is omission of relevant information. One way to omit is by simply you delete the context. Thomas Friedman of the New York Times published, of course many years later, that Western correspondents stationed in Beirut before 1982 did not even offer a hint about the well-known corruption of the PLO leadership there. He also noted that his correspondents judged the PLO with much more largesse than they did the Phalangists, Israelis, or Americans. One major reason was that these journalists in Beirut had to stay on good terms with the PLO, because when their foreign editor arrives, he otherwise wouldn't get the much wanted interview with Yasser Arafat. It is most likely that the behavior which Thomas Friedman, who himself is a master of double standards, is still practiced by many correspondents in the Arab world, because you cannot operate there without favor from the authorities. Thus, their criticism, if it at all exists, remains muted. Omissions by journalists are often the result of self-censorship. Only rarely media admit this. Well, we caught one case. On 12 October 2000, 2 Israeli reserve soldiers were lynched by Palestinians in Ramallah. The Italian private TV network, Mediaset, owned by Berlusconi, filmed the murder and smuggled the pictures out. And these included, among others, a Palestinian murderer who stood at a window with his, quote, his bloodied hands raised in triumph to signal to the crowd that the soldiers had been killed, end of quote. Riccardo Cristiano of the Italian state television, RAI, then wrote a letter published on 16 October in the Palestinian newspaper Al-Hayat Al-Jadida, and he discloses there the name of the Italian TV station which had taken the pictures. And as a result, Mediaset had to withdraw its correspondence from the area to avoid Palestinian revenge. Cristiano also declared that he would never have published himself the pictures had they been taken by him. So here you have a proof of somebody who really admits the story. In the Christian world, you find many examples of anti-Israeli double standards, in particular in liberal Protestant churches. It is difficult to provide an overview here because we have no monitoring of church bodies like we have, for instance, of American papers by Camera, or by Honest Reporting on other papers by NGO Monitor on NGOs on churches. There is nothing in a systematic way. The third one is disproportional behavior. The third category of double standard involves disproportional behavior. That is, when media report in detail on negative news about Israel and barely mention far more important negative news about Muslim states. Now, the Muslim states together have at least 100 times the population of Israel, and a huge number of transgressions of human rights and war crimes take place there. Which European media gives anyway near disproportional attention to these countries? As no country is without blame, many media stress Israel's shortcomings and remain noticeably silent about the great majority of the huge crimes in the Muslim and Arab world. And this continued disproportional behavior of the media has been a major factor in the demonization of Israel, which has taken place and which you have seen in the first slide I put up. NGO Monitor has exposed how Human Rights Watch, in its publication, uses disproportional behavior to demonize Israel. In 2008, it carried out a quantitative analysis of HRW's publications. It found that the NGO portrayed Israel as the second worst abuser of human rights in the Middle East after Saudi Arabia, ahead of Iran, Syria, Jordan, and Egypt. In that year, HRW condemned Israel for violation of human rights law, humanitarian law, or international humanitarian law. 33 times was it condemned compared with 13 citations for the Palestinians, 6 for Hezbollah, 5 for Egypt. NGO Monitor pointed out that HRW in that year placed Israel on a par with Sudan and the leaders from the former Yugoslavia, Congo, and Uganda. Another one is the fourth one of categories, the interference in Israel's internal affairs. A fourth type of these double standards is, for instance, which I already mentioned, the resolution unanimously adopted by the German parliament after the Gaza flotilla incident. It claimed that Israel's action didn't, inverted commas, serve the political and security interests of Israel. Well, there is a German social democrat parliamentarian, an acquaintance of mine, Gerd Weiskirch, a great friend of Israel, who wondered in an article of his, how could the German parliament possibly decide what serves the interests of Israeli security? And even if it could do so, how could it make such a decision without an intense dialogue with the Israeli Knesset? The fifth one category are discriminatory acts. And now, discriminatory acts, it overlaps. These categories are not very sharp. Some of them overlap, and sometimes you have two of them. Already almost a decade ago, Irvin Kotler, who later would become Canadian Minister of Justice and is quite well known to a few of you, referred to the United Nations as a paradigm of double standard practice against Israel. He said, in inverted commas. Despite the killing fields throughout the world, the UN Security Council sat from March to May 2002 in almost continuous session discussing a non-existent massacre in Geneva. Former Israeli ambassador, well known to you, to the UN, Dori Gold, related that in July 1997, the Arab states successfully convened an emergency special session of the General Assembly, which dealt with Israeli building practices in East Jerusalem at Har Homa. He says, I was ambassador at the UN in 1997 when the aforementioned emergency special session convened to discuss Israeli building at Har Homa. It recommended that the high contracting parties of the Fourth Geneva Convention, the signatories of the 1949 Convention that deals with the protection of civilians in times of war, be convened to take measures addressing Israeli violations of it. End of quote. Dori added, quote again, in order to prepare myself, I asked my colleagues in the Israeli Foreign Ministry over which issues the high contracting parties of the Fourth Geneva Convention had convened before to discuss similar so-called violations. And he asked, was there a session on when the Soviets invaded Afghanistan or Czechoslovakia? There was no such session. When Vietnam invaded Cambodia, there was no session. When Turkey invaded Cyprus, nothing. India invaded Pakistani territory, nothing. Morocco invaded the Western Sahara, nothing. It turned thus out, says Dori, that in about 50 years of the Fourth Geneva Convention's existence, the international community had never recommended the convening of its high contracting parties concerning any conflict. This despite the major use cases violating international peace and securities. The only case that remains until today, 2013, is the building of condominiums on a barren Jerusalem hill. And this was done with full European support. And this shows, by the way, how the Europeans, by their own declarations, have created this major example of contemporary anti-Semitism. Another illustration of this phenomena was when the British daily, The Independent, published a cartoon by Dave Brown, which depicted Sharon as a child eater, a new mutation of the medieval blood libel. The vilification, of course, ancient is, started in England, that the Jews need the blood of Gentile children for religious purposes. So, somebody took the Independent and Dave Brown to the UK Press Complaints Commission, and they said the cartoon is fine. Subsequently, this great anti-Semitic cartoon won the Political Cartoon Society Political Cartoon of the Year Award for 2003. Where was the competition held? On the premises of the well-known weekly The Economist. And who gave the award? For the Labour MP and former Labour Minister for Overseas Aid, Claire Short. So, at the time our ambassador in the UK was Zvi Stauber. And he asked the Independent's Jewish editor, Simon Kellner, whether the paper had ever published a similar caricature of any public figure. Well, Kellner checked it, and indeed, 18 years earlier, he found a similar cartoon. No. Boycotts and divestment. Now, another type of discriminatory acts which expresses double standards against Israel is the promotion of divestments and boycotts. One example among many is that of the Norwegian State Pension Fund, which divested from shares of some Israeli companies while keeping the shares of a number of highly unethical companies from Norway and other countries in its own portfolio. One example of this is the Odfjell company. The Odfjell company is a Norwegian tank farm company which has a tank farm in Rotterdam, which the tank farm had to be closed by the Dutch authorities because all kinds of dangerous chemicals were leaking from that farm, and if an explosion had occurred there, the whole of Rotterdam was in danger. Well, these shares you can find in the portfolio of the of the Norwegian pension fund. Now, 6.1 is double standards in applying international law. International law, a lawyer, former Israeli ambassador to the United States and France, Meir Hossein, has said, quote, there are two types of international law. One is applied to Israel, the others to all other states. This comes to the fore when one looks at the way Israel is treated in international institutions. Hossein mentions as a typical example the 2004 International Court of Justice advisory opinion on Israeli security defense. In its judgment, the Hague Court decided that the inherent right of self-defense is enforced only if you are confronted by a state. If this were true, then whatever the United States and its European allies undertook against Al-Qaeda is illegal. This cannot be considered self-defense according to the International Court under Article 51 of the UN Charter, because Al-Qaeda is not a state. Well, I come to one of my favorites and the last category I want to discuss today, which is called what I call Humanitarian Racism. This is a type of racism which is least recognized in the Western world. You attribute intrinsically reduced responsibility to people of certain ethnic or national group for their criminal acts and intention. Many left-of-center parties, human rights organizations, and development aid agencies are full with humanitarian racists. You find them everywhere. You find them, for instance, among progressive academics and in several mainstream Protestant denominations. These people judge misbehavior and crime differently according to the color and the power of those who commit the crimes. White people are held to different standards of responsibility than people of color are, for example. Israelis are blamed for whatever measures they take to defend themselves. Now, humanitarian racism goes together with demonization. In 1984, the Swedish Deputy Foreign Minister Pierre Schori, a social democrat, visits Israel. He praises Arafat and his flexible policy. In an article, he claims that the terrorist acts of the PLO are meaningless, while Israeli retaliatory acts were despicable acts of terrorism. In many European socialist parties, you find examples of whitewashing terrorism, and I say many and not all of them. The Greek socialists have always severely condemned domestic terrorism. However, following a judicial investigation, the Athens Court of Appeals and the Greek Supreme Court decided that Abdel Osama al-Zomar, an alleged Palestinian terrorist who was apprehended in Greece, should be extradited to Italy to face charges of bombing the Synagogue of Rome in October 1982. 34 people were injured and a 3-year-old child was killed. Well, the Greek socialist justice minister Vassilios Rotsis at the time uses his authority to overrule the court, stating that Osama's acts, killing a 3-year-old child, that he didn't say, were part of the Palestinian struggle for liberation of their homeland, and therefore cannot be considered acts of terrorism. Now, finally, the last few minutes, how do you combat double standard? That's a lecture in itself. But it is absolutely necessary, and it is really a shame that the Israeli government doesn't lift many fingers. In a fragmented postmodern society, there are many perpetrators of Israel hate, and many employ more than one category of double standards. Now, I have developed the 10 Commandments on how you fight delegitimization of Israel and anti-Semitism. They are up here, but I cannot discuss all of them. One of the ways to fight is you cannot fight as a small nation everybody. So you choose a few anti-Semites who use double standards, and you probably try to verbally destroy them. Because in my long career in various fields, I have seen that in all these fields most people are cowards. Many enjoy free anti-Semitic lunches. But once it becomes clear that you may have to pay for your free anti-Semitic lunch, the number of diners will rapidly drop. A greater role in combating double standards can be played by monitoring organizations. They know the main perpetrators in this field well, they can publish articles about their double standards, and you can also refer to earlier cases. In this way you get a fuller picture of misbehavior of specific organizations and individuals. NGO Monitor has been doing that. It follows a naming and shaming strategy on the UN. Much has been done by UN Watch and Eye on the UN. And you could similar, as I said already, investigate a number of church bodies. But there is presently nobody doing that. You have grassroots organizations who can play a role. For instance, if you start, as I did, I mean, when I want to recall to you that I started out less than 5 years ago on Norway, exposing the extreme hatred of Israel in the Norwegian government and in Norwegian civil society. Now, at that time I was alone. Even here at the JCPA, there were people who wondered why I was wasting my time on a country nobody knew anything about. Well, now we are already at a point where there is a parliamentary commission investigating in Norway whether the Norwegian government is indirectly financing murderers of Israeli civilians. So we have come a long way, and I cannot discuss the whole trajectory. We have come a long way from an isolated person devoting a part of a book to this issue to an issue where Dershowitz has said in the Wall Street Journal, Norway reminds me of South Africa before apartheid, where the leading non-fiction writer of Norway, Hannena Bintu Herland, has written, also said, that the JCPA Norway is the most anti-Semitic country in the West. You see that if you persevere, you start it, and others take it over, and today I'm a marginal player on the Norwegian field. Another way to fight double standards, if you have public figures who come out against them. And here we have to laud Canadian Prime Minister Stephen Harper, who said in 2010, quote, "We must be relentless in exposing the new anti-Semitism for what it is. Like any country, Israel may be subjected to fair criticism. And like any free country, Israel subjects itself to such criticism, healthy, necessary democratic debate. But when Israel, the only country in the world whose very existence is under attack, is consistently and conspicuously singled out for condemnation, I believe we are morally obliged to take a stand. Demonization, double standards, delegitimization, the 3 days, it is the responsibility of all of us to stand up to them." Until here, Harper. There are many ways to expose those who apply double standards. After the misplaced reaction of Germany's Bundestag to the Israeli action against the Gaza flotilla, you could send all members of the parliament emails when they do not make similar statements in far more severe cases. The more people spread this, the more it may prevent future repetition. Similar, you only have to copy a few broadcasts of the BBC which I mentioned, and you replace the British soldiers with the Israeli soldiers. You show what the BBC did, and then you insert the inverted scenes where Israeli troops are described in warm and glowing terms, with sympathy being evoked for them both as individuals and for their military predicament. And in contrast, you show in the movie the British troops, so you paint them as faceless, ruthless, brutal killers with little or no understanding shown for their actions. And that is even more easy because the Brits are fighting thousands of kilometers from their home. In 2011, Honest Reporting took a press release from the Associated Press on a NATO spokesman speaking about Libyan human shields in the military campaign there. It replaced the statements of the NATO spokesman by an IDF spokesperson, and the reactions of the Gaddafi government by statements from Hamas spokespeople during the Cast-Lead war. And the text sounds very similar. What honest reporting points out is that major media, including the New York Times, question the veracity of Gaddafi's statements of casualty figures, but have no problems with casualty figures from Hamas terrorist sources. There are many ongoing cases of double standards, and you could even open a website which once a week mentions new incidents of this type of anti-Semitism. Many people who do not have any compunction in using double standards against Israel might find unpleasant to be continuously exposed as anti-Semites. You may use legal means and so on. It's, as said, a subject for another lecture. Now, to conclude, an analysis of double standards used against Israel shows that they appear in a large number of fields and have permeated many aspects of Western society. The application of such double standards against Israel has a cumulative effect. That cumulative effect shows up in my first slide of all these people who now think that Israel is running a genocide war against the Palestinians. And these are huge numbers because if the 500 million Europeans, if you deduct babies, young people, and so on, and you take then the percentages here, you come to 150 million. That's enormous. And the Israeli government has the faintest idea about it. I mentioned the Bundestag, which in fact, if you send only one message, if you only once unanimously condemn one state, you send the message, Israel is the most evil state. And what does the most evil state do? That is not said, but that it commits genocide against the Palestinian. If you HRW gives more attention to you than it does to any of the extreme dictatorships in the Middle East other than Saudi Arabia, it's a demonizing act. If the BBC presents Israeli soldiers negatively, while British soldiers in the same situation are presented positively, you whitewash the legitimization of the Israeli army. The World Council of Churches is, of course, far less influential, but it trickles down. Their hatred of Israel trickles down to Christian organizations in several countries. So you have also individuals, journalists, who Middle East experts, so-called, who blame Israel for the stalled peace negotiation without even mentioning the peace offers of Prime Minister Barak and Olmert. It is a major failure, and I've already indicated that the successive Israeli governments and their lead officials have understood far too little of the nature of this demonization and delegitimization process and how double standards are used against them. At the same time, there is another aspect of all this. It shows you the moral decadence and degradation of Western societies. Jews have been a witness to the moral depravity of many societies and elements thereof throughout the ages. And the same, as I hope I have showed to you, is now true as far as Israel is concerned. Thank you for your attention.